ordinary experience, as atomic reality had no meaning. All that we had were phenomena produced in an experiment, and that and the quantum theory deals with the interrelationship of all these phenomena.
Bohr was not a professional philosopher. How much of traditional philosophers he read, one doesn't know. But he was an extremely intelligent man, and he must have thought through some of the issues that professional philosophers had thought through very deeply. And certainly one of the issues that he had thought through considerably, with some help, I think, from reading, was the Kantian issue of the status of a thing in itself. The thing as it really is, quite apart from any human perception of it. Bohr, like Kant, was very suspicious that one can say anything significant, intelligent, controllable about the thing in itself. He once said that physics or science in general is not about nature, it's about nature exposed to our observation. And that is very Kantian.
Now, for a long time actually, didn't know what this ayah means in the Quran. Because they're saying that things do not exist until you're watching it. And when you go to if you go to the sun and the moon and the stars and the planets, you see it, and the tables and the chair. When you go to subatomic level, it doesn't exist, unless you're measuring it. When you go to the quarks and electrons and photons, because photons act as a matter. When it hit my solar panel on my house, the photons split into positron and electron and generate electricity. The electron go inside my house. But when it is wave, when they tried to do the two-slit experiment, it acted as wave, and they were thinking about it as wave first, and then they said it's photons. In the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal said this ayah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله يمسك السماوات والأرض أن تزولا وإن زالتا من يمسكهما من بعده إن أمسكهما من أحد من بعده إنه كان حليما غفورا. Now يمسك is actually get hold. Yumsiku. I mean, it translates it sustains. It could be sustains a little bit. Yumsiku is amsaka yumsiku. So what this ayah means? That is Allah Azza wa Jalla making the universe in place so we can see it. When they discovered the Higgs boson, they called it God particle, because they think the Higgs boson is what is the power field which causes the existence of the matter, the other subatoms. So, in summary, we don't really know what Allah has created, what we are watching. We don't know. Philosophers before were saying that it doesn't exist until there's a receiver, and now the scientists said no, it don't exist, and Einstein said yes, it exists, this locality in this, and then now the quantum mechanics, which is now the main field, saying no, it doesn't exist unless you're measuring it. So in Allah yumsiku samawati wal ard, I don't know. That's really interesting, and we will not know unless we meet Allah Azza wa Jal. Now we are going to move about the meaning of knowledge, because it has something to do with whether you have belief or knowledge about Allah Azza wa Jal. So you have a lot of jargons that philosophers use. Is having knowledge is something the same thing as being correct? If you believe something to be true, and it is true, does it matter if you believe it's justified or not? And can you be right about something without really trying? So you know something exists, you believe something exists, you have proposition about something, and you have justification if you believe. So knowledge, they say, it's justified true belief. So here, belief is a proposition. You might want to believe Allah exists, angels exist. Justification, you have the evidence to support your belief. Yes, I have evidence that Allah exists. So proposition is what you propose. The continuum of your assessment. Assertion, you have tested and you asserted because of the results of your studies. It might have true value, might have false value. So they have these jargons, the philosophers. There's false and true beliefs and values. You have justified true belief. You have positive and negative attitude to what you believe or disbelieve. You either asserted or you are proposing, and you have the propositional attitude of belief. You're proposing that you believe is true and you are convinced about it. And you have testimony, somebody told you. Like, the Quran came and the Bible and whatever, hadith. Now, Allah doesn't expect you to have belief. Allah wants you to have knowledge. Allah says, فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. فَعْلَمْ. It's a knowledge. It's not false belief, I'm unseen, I don't know, my mom told me, my dad. You have to reach the stage when you have the knowledge. Justified, true belief. And you have justification. True belief. And Allah said, the way around it, like what Ibrahim said, قَالَ بَرُّكُمْ رَبُّكُمْ وَرَبُّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ الَّذِي فَطَرَهُنَّ. The one who created this belief, this universe, is Allah, is your God. The one who brought these tables is Brother Elias. The one who bought these, so-and-so, ordered it and came from the factory. The one who built this building, it's called like Bryant's building firm, whatever. The one who created the whole universe, Allah should say, Allah created it. And this is what Ibrahim said. You don't have to bring any evidence. There's no sound brain, if you want somebody to prove to you that it is day now and the sun is there. If I want to prove to you there is a sun, I'll just walk away. I don't want to prove to you. The sun is there and it's daylight, it is day. Whether you believe or not, it's your problem. And Allah says, وَقُلْ الْحَقُّ مِنْ رَبِّكُمْ فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. But that doesn't care, Allah. Allah wants you to believe, but if you don't believe, that's it. Don't believe. He is not in need for your belief. And then they were talking about science and pseudoscience. So you need always to find a lot of answers to your belief in Allah that He exists to become knowledge. فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. It has to be moved from believing La ilaha illallah to knowing La ilaha illallah. And you can't become a Muslim unless you say Ashhadu and La ilaha illallah. I bear witness, I have witnessed La ilaha illallah. If you say Ashhadu La ilaha illallah without actually witnessing, you're witnessing something you haven't seen. So go back and renew your shahada, because your shahada is not valid, because you're witnessing something you haven't seen. Like, who flew this drone in Gatwick? You can't come and say, I saw it, unless you have evidence. And you saw with your own eyes. So you can't witness. And the same for Islam. You can't say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, unless you have knowledge, justified, true belief that La ilaha illallah. And the easiest for Ibrahim to say, the one who created this. I believe in the one who created the universe. I don't want even to tell you the name.
Shall we all do a shahada after this then?
So the next one is about science and pseudoscience, and what the criteria of science and pseudoscience. And you will see the difference between Freud and Einstein.
Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace, share your passion with the world.
Imagine being alive when Albert Einstein was developing his theories of relativity, or witnessing the birth of psychology as Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis took over the scientific mainstream. The early 1900s was an amazing time for Western science. There was another figure on the intellectual scene when these great minds were at work. Young philosopher Karl Popper was born in Austria, Freud's home turf, but built his career in Britain, giving serious consideration to the new ways that these and other scientists of the time were thinking about the world. And after looking at different methods that people like Einstein and Freud were using, Popper came to an understanding that not all scientific achievement was created equal. He ended up making an important distinction between science and what he called pseudoscience. And in the process of doing this, he taught us volumes about the nature of knowledge itself and how we can best test it and challenge it to bring us closer to the truth. Emerging at roughly the same point in history, Freud and Einstein both made predictions that they hoped would help us better understand our world. Freud, concerned with the individual psyche, predicted that our childhood experiences would have a heavy bearing on who we grew up to be. Meanwhile, Einstein waited patiently for a solar eclipse that could disprove his entire general theory of relativity, depending on what it would reveal about how light travels through space. And then there was Karl Popper, born in 1902, who grew up to observe these predictions with keen interest. As a young scholar, he learned about the psychoanalytic theories of Freud and attended lectures given by Einstein himself about the rules of the universe. And he noticed that these great thinkers used different methods. For example, Popper observed that Freud was able to make just about any data point work in service of his theory. Freud could explain a person's intimacy issues, both in terms of not being hugged enough as a child or in terms of having been hugged too much. Meanwhile, almost any behavior on the part of a female could be explained in terms of penis envy. Evidence to support Freud's theories seemed to be everywhere. But Popper saw that Einstein was making a different type of prediction. Instead of looking backward and using past data to predict the present, he was looking ahead and predicting future states of affairs. Einstein's theory was truly risky, Popper realized, because if the future didn't match his predictions, then his theory would be conclusively disproven. If the results of the solar eclipse in 1919 had been different, general relativity would have been finished. Freud, on the other hand, could always just read the past differently so as to maintain some kind of confirmation of his theory. Suddenly, Popper understood the difference between the science that Einstein was doing and what Freud was doing, which Popper rather snootily referred to as pseudoscience. Now, whether psychology today is considered a hard science or a social science or some other kind might be debatable, but you won't find many mainstream thinkers who consider it pseudoscience. But still, nearly 100 years ago, when Popper was reaching these conclusions, no modern philosopher had really characterized what science truly meant and what the implications were for the pursuit of knowledge. The traditional understanding of the scientific method, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, relied on the belief that to look at the world with a scientific eye is to observe with no preconceived notions. You simply look, see what you see, and then develop hypotheses based on those observations. So, you look at a swan, and you notice it's white. You look at another swan, it's white too. You look at enough white swans, and eventually you hypothesize that all swans are white. This is what Freud said he was doing, observing relationships. But instead of it being the relationship between swans and their colors, it was between particular human phenomena and human behavior. But Popper argued that everyone has preconceived notions of some kind. We all start out with a hunch, whether we admit it or not. After all, what you decide to observe is determined by what you already care about enough to observe in the first place. And the fact that you care about it so much means that you already have some beliefs about it. So, what does that tell us about Freud? Popper became convinced that methods like his that only served to confirm beliefs were pseudoscience, and they could be used to prove anything. Consider the existence of Santa Claus. If I try to find evidence of Santa's existence, I'm gonna find it easily. The world is filthy with evidence of Santa Claus. There are presents under the tree on Christmas morning, there's the guy at the mall, and then there are all those songs and stories and TV shows and movies. They combine to confirm your belief in Santa. But Popper would argue that it's only by seeking to disprove Santa's existence that you can demonstrate his unreality. So the question is, when we begin to test a theory, are we looking to confirm it or to disconfirm it? This is the key point. For Popper, science disconfirms, while pseudoscience confirms. He elaborated on this insight by establishing a series of distinct conclusions about science and knowledge. First, he said, it's easy to find confirmation of a theory if you're looking for it. Remember the presents under the tree? If you're looking for proof that Santa exists, you're not likely to keep searching for contradictory evidence after that. Second, confirmation should only count if it comes from risky predictions, ones that could actually destroy your theory. Because Popper observed that every good scientific theory is prohibitive. It rules things out. This might sound strange because no one wants to be wrong, but Popper says that every false belief we discover is actually good, because that gets us that much closer to believing only true things. Next, Popper argued that the only genuine test of a theory is one that's attempting to falsify it. So if you were to test for Santa's reality, your method would require you to try to prove that he doesn't exist, rather than proving that he does.
Now I'll stop here and then go to the ayah, inshallah. So, by the way, if you want to leave, don't leave until you see at least 9, 10, and 11, the most important part of it, and probably 12 as well. So as pseudoscience, Freud said, you are this and this and this, and then he modified his theory along the way. Albert Einstein said, no, this is the way the universe exists, this is the speed of light, blah, 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 blah. Allah Azza wa Jal wants us to go and study how the camels were created. Like the camels are the only animals which has spindle-like red blood cells. And when they are thirsty, the cells go inside the tissue so to remain enough fluid to go around, and they have the ability to store water for longer journey. There's a beautiful film produced, unfortunately, by Israel about how mighty the creation of camels are. وَإِلَى السَّمَاءِ كَيْفَ رُفِعَتْ, and how the heavens been raised, and how the mountain were erected, and how the earth were spread out. And then Allah Azza wa Jalla challenging us, don't believe until you go, one or two of you, and think about the religion Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam brought, that he has no jinnah. It's not like act of jinnis or act of magic or anything. He is just a true warner. So he is challenging us to go and think what Allah did, where all this came from. Is there a creator? Like Darwin was talking about the evolution theory, and they were talking about static state theory, the universe always there, until Hubble came and we showed with his telescopes, and no, the universe actually expanding. So as one beast exploded, there were no universe 13.67 billion years ago. So science came to show that it is actually, there's a start to this universe, and this starts from that end. So when you go and you want to prove the religion, you have to study really and think about it. Go to the science and technology and history and the religions before us. Now the next one is the argument of the Christian, how God exists or doesn't exist, and see what the philosopher, they actually were caught by a philosopher really quite hard. They can't escape. So this is, Issam is one of the bishops in Canterbury here in Britain.
You misplay.
No, it should go by itself.
Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace, share your passion with the world.
It's about time we had a serious talk about religion. The philosophy of religion is often confused with theology, which makes sense because they both take God and religion as their subjects. But theology starts with assuming that God exists and then figures out what follows, where theology might try to solve philosophical problems that might arise from a belief in God. But one thing that's never on the table in theology is simply not believing in God. Atheism is not an option. That's what separates the philosophical study of religion from the theological. Philosophers take nothing as a given, and that includes religious belief. Everything is on the table and everything needs an argument. So no area of belief is sacred, and that means even your sacred beliefs are going to need to be examined and evidence will need to be given. Some people say that religion is the one area where you don't need arguments, that faith alone is enough. But philosophers don't take faith for an answer. After all, I might have faith that the moon is made of green cheese. So what? Faith is definitionally unprovable, which makes it, from a philosophical perspective, not valuable. So if you're a theist, now's the time to offer some justifications for your beliefs. And if you're an atheist, it's time for you to pay attention too. No one's off the hook. We all need to pay attention to these arguments because religion is hugely important. Can you think of many things that have been as influential in shaping human history than religious belief? Probably not. So if we can get to the bottom of it, we should. I'll get to God in a minute, but first I want to go over a few things that the philosophy of religion is not. It's not about believing whatever your parents taught you, because that doesn't prove anything about the truth of a religious belief. If how you were raised proved something about religious truth, then every religion, and therefore also no religion, would be true. So how you were raised could give you a reason that you hold a certain belief, but it says nothing whatsoever about its truth. Philosophy of religion is also not the study of the Bible, because you can't use what's written in a book to prove the truth of the book. You need outside evidence. There's also a whole area of scholarship devoted to understanding the Bible by considering the time and place in which it was written, and such study can be very helpful in understanding certain things about religion. But it doesn't help us here. Philosophy of religion is also not religious anthropology or religious sociology or psychological understanding of our reasons for religious belief. Those are all wonderful things that you can and should study, but they are not what we're studying here. What we are doing is considering whether we can offer arguments in support of belief in God's existence. And a long time ago there was a a man who argued that God's existence is provable, 11th century French monk Anselm of Canterbury. He offered a deductive argument for the existence of God based on what he understood to be the nature of God's being, or the definition of God. Because the study of being is called ontology, his argument and others like it are called ontological arguments. Now, what do you think God is like? Long, flowing white beard, robe to match, nice guy, hard to reach on the phone. Well, Anselm aimed a little bit higher. In fact, he thought God is, by definition, the best possible thing we can imagine. The best thing. Just try to think of the coolest, awesomest, most amazing and wonderful thing you can imagine, and whatever you're thinking of, Anselm said that God is better. He's just the best. In Anselm's words, God is that than which no greater can be conceived. So what does that mean? Well, it means that God must exist, according to Anselm. After all, he pointed out there are just two ways in which something can exist. Something can exist only in our minds and be strictly imaginary, like Santa or unicorns, or it can exist in our minds but also in reality, like pizza and horses, something that we can imagine, but that's also real. Anselm pointed out, and he does appear to be right about this, that any good thing would be better if it existed in reality as well as in our minds. I mean, unicorns, they're pretty great, but wouldn't they be better if they were real? Or the perfect romantic partner, smart, funny, hot, likes the same movies and games that you do, pretty rich, would be pretty nice in your mind, but even better if they actually existed. Well, Anselm thought so too, and from there he believed he could prove God's existence. Because if we define God as the greatest thing that we can conjure up in our minds, the only thing that could possibly be greater than him would be a real version. And since we're already imagining the greatest thing possible, there can't be anything better, therefore God has to exist both in imagination and in reality. Anselm was sure that he had done it, deductively proven God's existence in a way that was immune to error. Here it is one more time, laid out as a philosophical argument. God is the greatest thing we can think of. Things can exist only in our imaginations, or they can also exist in reality. Things that exist in reality are always better than things that exist only in our imaginations. If God existed only in our imaginations, he wouldn't be the greatest thing that we can think of, because God in reality would be better, therefore God must exist in reality. Anselm thought this was a tidy little argument, but one of his contemporaries, a fellow French monk named Ghannam, wasn't satisfied. He suggested that we could run the same line of reasoning to prove the existence of literally anything we can imagine. He came up with an argument with the exact same formal structure as Anselm's to prove that a mythical lost island exists. He proposed the best island I can imagine is one where I can swim and relax on a tropical beach and ski down snow-covered mountains all in one afternoon. I can imagine it, so it must exist. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the best island. There would be one better, and that one would have to be real. Basically, Ghannam said, you could make the same kind of argument to prove the existence of whatever you most wanted, but it wouldn't make it real. Anselm responded to Ghannam's criticism by saying that he'd missed the point, that the argument only works for necessary beings, of which there is only one. God. Folks, what we have right here is a classic example of the fallacy known as begging the question. A fallacy is a flaw in reasoning, something that weakens or destroys an argument, and when you beg the question, you assume the very thing you're trying to prove with your argument. By adding this idea of a necessary being to his definition of God, Anselm makes God's existence a part of the definition of God. A necessary being is one that must exist, so Anselm's response assumed the very point of contention to be true, that God exists. Other philosophers since Anselm have tried to save his argument by tweaking it in various ways, and dissenters have continued trying to deflate them. One of the most famous objections came hundreds of years after Anselm's time from the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant offered the point that, as he put it, existence is not a predicate. A predicate is just something that's said of another object, and Kant thought Anselm's mistake was in thinking that existence is something that can be predicated upon a thing or used as a defining characteristic. For example, if a triangle exists, it necessarily has three sides, but it could be that no triangle exists at all because the idea of existence isn't part of how we define a triangle. Likewise, Kant would say, if God exists, then he must be the greatest being that we can imagine, but that does not mean that he does exist. Predicates add to the essence of their subjects, Kant explained, but they can't be used to prove their existence. British philosopher John Wisdom came up with a thought exercise that sounds a lot like a debate over an ontological argument. It's called The Parable of the Invisible Gardener, which brings us to this week's Flash Philosophy. philosophy. Let's go to the thought bubble. Person A and Person B return to a garden after a long absence and notice that a few of its plants are still thriving. Person A says a gardener must have been tending the garden while they were gone. Person B doubts this is true, so they agree to wait and see if a gardener shows up. After some time passes, they see no one, so Person A says the gardener must be invisible. So they put up traps and bring in bloodhounds to catch him. When no one is found, Person A says the gardener must be intangible as well as unsmellable, to which B replies, what's the difference between an invisible, intangible, unsmellable, entirely undetectable gardener and no gardener at all? Thanks, Thought Bubble. Can you guess who A and B are really talking about? To give you a sense of how long this back and forth has been going on among philosophers trying to either prove or disprove the existence of God, John Wisdom came up with this parable in 1944, nearly 1,000 years after Anselm and Guanilo. Today, we introduced a new area of philosophy of religion, and we learned about Anselm's argument for God's existence, while also considering objections to that argument. An important point to note here is that both Guanilo and Kant agreed with Anselm's conclusion. They also believed in God's existence. They just thought Anselm's argument didn't prove it. So remember, you can think an argument fails even if you accept the conclusion. When this happens, you should look for a better argument in favor of your conclusion. This is exactly what Thomas Aquinas did, and we'll consider him next time. This episode is brought...
Right, so, subhanAllah, Allah Azza wa Jal, He's the creator of the human mind and how we operate. So the first thing you need to consider in Islam straight away, Allah said, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. Nothing similar to Allah Azza wa Jal. How are you going to detect Him? Obviously Allah is not smellable, you can't see Him, you can't touch Him, you can't feel Him, you can't go to Him. He said, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, nothing similar to Allah. So don't waste your time, try to prove scientifically Allah exists. You're going to reach it. It's not possible. And the scholar said, مَا خَطَرَ عَلَى بَالِكَ فَاللَّهُ خِلَافُ ذَلِكَ. Whatever comes to your mind, Allah is different. Whatever comes to your mind, Allah is different. It's not what you think. And also Allah Azza wa Jal didn't accept that you follow religion because your father was a religious. What He said, we're not considering what your dad told you. It's what Allah said. You can't say, بل قالوا إنا وجدنا آباءنا على أمة وإنا على آثارهم مهتدون. It's not accepted. You have to search yourself. You're following your dad and his granddad and granddad. It's not accepted in Islam. You have to establish your religion yourself. Also, the Quran is not used by Allah Azza wa Jal to make people believe. Because Allah Azza wa Jal said, it is a guidance and cure to those who already believe. But if they don't believe, it will be, for them, they will never hear it, as they have deafness in their ears, and it will be blinded to them. They will not understand the Quran. They will not see Allah through the Quran. You have to believe in Allah, the creator of the universe, and you come to the Quran, you benefit from it. Otherwise, not the other way around. And Allah Azza wa Jalla said, سَأَصْرِفُ عَنْ آيَاتِ الَّذِينَ يَتَكَبَّرُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. I will not show my signs and my Quran to those who are arrogant. You have to humble yourself. Ask Allah Azza wa Jalla to show you the Quran, show you His existence through the Quran, the belief in Him through the Quran. So that has to be done by Allah Azza wa Jalla to you. Otherwise, you won't benefit from the Quran. Now, what they're talking about here is something which exists in our mind, but strictly imaginary, like Santa and unicorn. Something exists in our mind and in reality, like pizza and horses. And Immanuel Kant said you cannot use must exist as a proof of existence. That in Arabic they use wajib al-wujud. If you go to wajib al-wujud, it must exist. It doesn't actually exist in the Quran or the Hadith. It's more the philosopher who were looking into the philosophy at the time of Al-Ghazali and similar, and came with this phrase that Allah wajib al-wujud. While it is not. When you go to the really good established scholars, they say no. Wajib al-wujud means that he is not brought by anybody. Nobody created him. He is mawjood already. It's not wajib al-wujud, he is mawjood. It's not like, you search for something that doesn't exist. But here, he is mawjood. Like he gave the argument of the invisible garden. That if it's not smellable, it's not if it's invisible, intangible, unsmellable, entirely undetectable, it doesn't exist. No, Allah said, no, you will not find me visible, touchable, smellable. No, Anything comes to your mind is different. ليس كمثله شيء. So you wouldn't go with your lens and find Allah. You will not go with your telescope find Allah. You cannot send a mission to space to find Allah. No. He is the one who you think, my mind. أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ. Allah question, are they created from nothing? Or they are the creator? Or they created the heavens and earth? So you must come to your senses, say, no, the one who created this universe is Allah. This universe came because Allah created it. I don't need more than that. So that's obvious. And nobody created itself. Even Allah did not create himself. Nothing come from nothing. Even Allah did not create himself. Allah always there. Allah mawjood all the time. أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ. When Musa asked a question to Allah to see Allah, he said, make me see you. Allah didn't say to him, you will not see me. He said, yes, fine, look at that mountain. If the mountain stay where it is, you will see me. In the mountain, when Allah made himself like Allah used the word تَجَلَّى رَبُّهُ لِلْجَبَلِ فَلَمَّا تَجَلَّى رَبُّهُ لِلْجَبَلِ جَعَلَهُ دَكَّةً. When now the word tajalla has different meaning. Tajalla, you clear something which is unclear. You make it clearer. Jelly, clean something. You clear something, become obvious. So you can see through the mirror, through the glass. When Allah made himself slightly, sensible to the mountain gone, disappeared. And Musa collapsed. So it's not like Allah is not seeable. Allah make you see him, but you can't see him. Allah has to make you see him, and Allah will do that in next life, in paradise. Allah will create you in a way you can see, obviously, of Allah. Because Allah is not called compass. You can't see the start of Allah or the end. There's no start or end. There's no time to Allah Azza wa Jal. And back again, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. Always, when you think about Allah Azza wa Jal, nothing similar to him. This is why you can never find Allah in the microscope, under the microscope or telescope or any other method. The next one, talking about the Aquinas cosmological arguments, which is quite interesting because he mirrored what Al-Ghazali said. Al-Ghazali was born in 1058 and he died 1103, and Aquinas he was born 1224, died 1274, but really most of it is taken from Al-Ghazali.
Downstairs. From downstairs. Somebody talking downstairs.
Yeah, but they shouldn't leave the... I switched it off myself.
They switched it on maybe.
Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace, share your passion with the world.
Nothing gets people talking like proving the existence of God. Just look at the comments on our last video. And that is what Anselm of Canterbury did. He claimed in the 11th century to have come up with a deductive proof of God's existence through what we now know as the ontological argument. And if there was such a thing as a social network of medieval Christian philosophers back then, it was positively abuzz with the news for a long time. Because almost 200 years later, Italian theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas encountered Anselm's argument. But, like many others, he just didn't buy it. Aquinas did believe in God. It was just that, as a philosopher, he felt that it was important to have evidence for your beliefs. He knew that if he was going to dismiss Anselm's argument, he'd need to come up with something better. So he set out to construct 5 arguments that would prove God's existence once and for all. Yeah, 5. Apparently he was concerned that 1 wasn't going to do it, so he figured that out of 5, 1 was bound to stick. His first 4 arguments are known together as the cosmological arguments, as they seek to prove God's existence through what he argued were necessary facts about the universe. So in keeping with the method that we discussed in our very first episode, we're going to examine these first 4 arguments of Thomas Aquinas and really try to understand them. And then we'll consider their merits and their weaknesses. Maybe the most striking thing about the cosmological arguments of Aquinas, at least to modernize, is that some of them are firmly based in the natural world. Even though he lived in a pretty unscientific time, Aquinas argued for the existence of God through his understanding of science, and with the help of what he thought was physical evidence. For example, the first of his cosmological arguments is known as the argument from motion. In it, Aquinas observed that we currently live in a world in which things are moving, and he also observed that movement is caused by movers, things that cause motion. Aquinas was convinced that everything that's moving must have been set into motion by something else that was moving. By this logic, something must have started the motion in the first place. Otherwise, you'd be stuck in a philosophical quandary known as an infinite regress. You get an infinite regress when, in a chain of reasoning, the evidence for each point along the chain relies on the existence of something that came before it, which in turn relies on something even further back, and so on, with no starting point. Basically, Aquinas thought the very idea of infinite regress was absurd, logically impossible, because it implied that any given series of events began with nothing, or more accurately, never really began. Instead, it could have been going on forever. In the case of physical motion, Aquinas wanted to trace the cause of the movement he saw in the world all the way back to its beginning. And he figured there must have been a beginning. Otherwise, for him, it would be like watching these blocks fall and being told that nothing ever pushed over the first block. Instead, they had always been falling down forever, backward into eternity. There must have been a time when nothing was in motion, Aquinas thought, and there also must have been a static being that started the motion. And that being, according to Aquinas, is God, the unmoved mover. So, his argument for motion ran something like this. Objects are in motion. Everything in motion was put into motion by something else. There can't be an infinite regress of movers, so there must be a first mover, itself unmoved. And that is God. Now, the second cosmological argument of Aquinas was a lot like his first one. Here he proposed the argument from causation, and it too sets out to avoid the problem of an infinite regress. But instead of it explaining the motion of objects, it set out to explain causes and effects in general all over the universe. The argument went along these lines. Some things are caused. Anything that's caused has to be caused by something else, since nothing causes itself. There can't be an infinite regress of causes, so there must have been a first causer, itself uncaused, and that is God. Just like with the argument for motion, the point here is pretty simple. Effects have causes. If you think about how you wound up watching this video, you can trace the line of causation back from moment to moment. If you think about it long enough, you can probably go pretty far back. But Aquinas said, again, it can't go back forever. There had to be a first thing that started off the chain of causes and effects. And that thing is God. Argument number 3 was the argument from contingency. And we should step back and get a little background for this one. In philosophy, we often distinguish between necessary beings and contingent beings. A contingent being is, simply put, any being that could have not existed. That includes you. Sure, you do exist, but you could not have. If you had never been born, the world would go on. And yes, things would be different. We've all seen It's a Wonderful Life, but the world would go on. Instead, your existence is merely contingent on the existence of other things. In your case, you only exist because a certain sperm met a certain egg and swapped some genetic information. You're basically a fluke. But what does that have to do with God? Well, again, Aquinas believed that there had to be something that prevented an infinite regress of contingency. That would mean that the contingency on which everything existed would just keep going back in time. And we can't have a world where everything is contingent, Aquinas said, because then, by definition, it all could easily have never existed. So he needed at least one necessary being. A being that has always existed, that always will exist, and that can't not exist in order to get everything going. And that necessary